Hello and welcome to the show that has no name yet. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this video is by request. I received an email from somebody that apparently is a Buddhist monk in Thailand, and he asked me if I could do a video on how to make robes properly. And I'm a little bit bashful about this, like telling monks how to do their job when I'm not a monk anymore. Although I suppose I am qualified to explain how to make monk robes. In fact, I'm probably more qualified than most ordained monks now. I may attempt some visual graphics um, in this video, like putting them on the screen, but um, I'll have to make them because all of my old drawings with regard to how to sew robes are gone, and my illustrated Vinaya books, like that have pictures on robes and the various parts of them and so forth. I left those behind when I left the monastery, so I just assumed I wouldn't need them anymore. And here I am finally making a video on how to make robes. I was planning for years, just sort of toying with the idea of writing a blog post about it. And I do have a book, Essays in Theravada Buddhism, that does have a lot of technical stuff in it, like um, how to bake a bowl, for example, or how to use the night sky as a calendar in accordance with like ancient Indian Buddhist astronomy. But I never got around to a detailed explanation of how to make robes. And so this will be it, I assume. Um, the best illustrations I know of for making robes, and with a lot of illustrations on how to make or how to wear robes, is in a book called The Entrance to the Vinaya, or the Vinaya Mukha, Volume 2, which was written by the Prince Patriarch Vajiranyana Rasa, who was a prince, literally. He was the son of King Mongkut, and he became Sangha Raja in Thailand like 100 years or more ago. And he he mentions a lot about robes and has um, illustrations and so forth. But I don't have that book with me anymore because I left my Vinaya books at the monastery when I left. But I do have the last two robes, my upper and lower monk robes, still here. That my upper robe right here. So I can kind of use those as illustrations or examples or something. And the thing is, most monks just kind of follow along with tradition and what the other monks are doing, but I never really had that approach. I wanted to follow by the book what monks are supposed to do, and so I studied up on how to make monk robes. And it was kind of difficult at times. I couldn't really get away with it when I was a junior monk and having to fit in and follow along with what a teacher told me to do. But once I was on my own, independent, after I had 5 rains retreats under my belt and so forth, I could start wearing monk robes that, although correct, or at least more correct, according to the actual Vinaya Pitaka, the ancient Pali texts, they just don't look right when you compare them with what everybody else is wearing, because things have changed, and just how monks wear robes and make robes and so forth is significantly different than it was in ancient times. So, as I say, most monks probably do not know how to make a monk robe like completely kosher, completely according to the rules of monastic discipline. And I'm gonna do my best, but it's not easy, because even by the time of the commentaries, apparently they were um, getting confused or forgetting the meanings of certain words and so forth. But we'll get to that. So a monk's robes in Pali are called Cīvara. Cīvara. And they're just essentially rectangles of cloth that are worn around the body in certain ways. And it wasn't a special uniform that monks wore that set them apart from everybody else by wearing rectangles of cloth, sort of like a toga or something, because apparently pretty much everybody in the ancient Ganges Valley during the Buddhist time were wearing similar clothing. So monk's robes are representing just sort of a shabbier, browner version of what most people were wearing in the Ganges Valley like 2,500 years ago. And a monk is allowed to own 3 robes: an upper robe, a lower robe, and an outer robe. The lower robe is called the Andravasaka, the upper robe is called the Udarasanga, and the outer robe is called the Sangati. And the lower robe is just worn like a sarong. I might demonstrate how it's worn towards the end of this video. And the upper robe in the Buddhist time was usually worn pretty much like a large shawl, just kind of thrown over both shoulders. And the outer robe likewise was worn in the same way. But the outer robe, or Sangati, was usually 2 layers of cloth. So that was sort of like the coat. And again, I may try to demonstrate a few ways of wearing robes towards the end of this video. I have the idea that it might be a long one. So the size of a Cīvara is, according to the Patimokkha rules, it's a Pacitya rule, towards the end of the Pacitya rules. The max, a robe has to be smaller than the Buddha's own robe, and the Buddha's own robe was 9 handspans by 6 handspans, according to the Buddha's own hand, called the Sugata Widati. That was the Buddha's own handspan. And this is in the Patimokkha itself. But the commentarial tradition to the Patimokkha has it worked out so that the Buddha was 3.5 times as tall as the average person, and his handspan was 3.5 times the size of an ordinary person's handspan. So that would make it like this, too big to fit on the screen. And I mean, making a rule that says a monk has to wear a robe that's smaller than 9 handspans by 6 handspans, with the handspan being 3.5 times the size of an ordinary handspan. I mean, it's just meaningless. It's not even a rule. It's like if we assume that the Buddha was taller than a giraffe, then the rule is saying that an upper robe can't be more than about 23 feet long and about 15 feet wide, which, I mean, no monk would even want a robe that big. So they were much smaller than that. And so wearing the upper robe in the usual Asian ways, like in Thailand, they've got it all wrapped around one arm and all that. I mean, it's just a later development. And technically, I mean, really technically, according to the letter of the law, it's against the rules. Not just wearing it that way, but just having a robe that's big enough to wear it that way. So there have been monks that have written books on Vinaya, like the Vajrayana Rasa, Venerable Vajrayana Rasa, and also much later Ajahn Thanisaro. They agreed that the Buddha was not taller than a giraffe. That obviously, you read the texts, including the Vinaya texts, there are times when an ordinary person would meet the Buddha and think he was just an ordinary monk. Or there's like in the Samanyapala Sutta, which is one of the first suttas in the Digha Nikaya, the king Ajatasattu wants to go and see the Buddha, and when he gets to where the monks are staying, he asks his guide Jivaka the doctor, which one is the Buddha? And Jivaka the doctor says, well, he's the one who's leaning against the post facing east, I think. I can't remember, east or west. He was facing in a different direction from the other monks because, he's going to be talking to them, so they're like the audience. So Jivaka the doctor didn't say, oh, he's that gigantic one, And there's like cases of the Buddha and Mahakassapa exchanging robes. which they couldn't do if the Buddha was gigantic and everyone else was like normal sized. So um, the Thai Sangha Raja and Ajahn Tanisro in their respective Vinaya books agree that a reasonable guess for how big the Buddha's own handspan was it'd be like the handspan of a relatively large person. I've got a relatively big hand, which is like 25 centimeters or about 10 inches. So that would be a good guess. I mean, you might want to make it a little bit smaller just to make sure, you know, you want to be absolutely sure you're not breaking the rule. So if we go with the 25 centimeter handspan for the Buddha as the measurement, as like a measurement that a monk's robe has to be smaller than, then a monk's robe would be like 2.25 meters in length, or like 7 feet, by about 1.5 meters, or about 5 feet. And my own robes, when I made them, like this one, to make sure it was less than 9 by 6, I'd make it 8.5 by 6. And then my lower robe, I'd make it 9 by 5. And so it's about half the size of a standard monk's robe today, would be the probably the size of robes that monks were wearing, or maybe even smaller, because I'm relatively tall, and most Asian monks are considerably shorter than me and wouldn't need as big of a robe as I have. So there are 6 allowable materials for a monk's robe to be made out of, and that is linen, cotton, silk, wool, sun hemp, and hemp. And these last two are a little bit controversial because the commentaries, or the commentators, like the medieval Sri Lankan and South Indian commentators, were apparently unfamiliar with the Pali word sana. And that is what I just translated as sun hemp. It's regarding, it's a plant called sun hemp or Bengali hemp. And apparently the sun in sun hemp comes from the same root word as the Pali term sana. But the commentators didn't know what it was, so they said that sana was regular hemp, and that the next word, banga, which usually means hemp, just means a mixture of any of the above listed fabrics or materials. And I mean, that's just a wild guess, and it seems pretty obviously to be a wrong guess. And this is one of the difficulties of trying to follow Vinaya correctly, because the commentators often didn't know what they were talking about, and the translators, like modern translators, often, I mean, they're not monks, and so they don't know. Like the only complete translation of the Vinaya Pitaka into English that I'm aware of was by I.B. Horner, who was some English lady who lived, you know, almost 100 years ago. And she had never been a monk, obviously, and she was just guessing, you know, making her best guesses as to what certain terms would mean. And I mean, she was doing essentially the same as a lot of the commentators who were monks in Sri Lanka and South India in the early medieval times. But getting back to robes, although a robe is a simple rectangle of cloth, it is made up of smaller parts sewn together. And probably the original reason for this is that originally monks were making the robes out of rags, like discarded rags that they'd pick up off the ground. So you'd have like little pieces of cloth, and you have to sew them together into a bigger robe. Later on, after Buddhism became more mainstream, more popular, and you had like people, including rich people, wanting to offer good cloth to monks to make robes, they stuck with the cutting it up and sewing it back together, partly because it made the cloth less valuable. Like the cloth was worth less to thieves; it'd be less likely to be stolen. Also, the monks would be less ostentatious by, you know, wearing like really nice clothes, like, you know, like the lay people, like householders who enjoy pleasures of the senses. And there's a special way of sewing it together, but I'll get to that in a little bit here. Um, Again, translators tend to be clueless. The commentators sometimes, not always, but occasionally are clueless. And so I had to really investigate the texts on how to make a monk robe, how to make monk robes properly, because I wanted to do that. I wanted to follow the rules, especially when I was a junior monk. I didn't have good samadhi yet, didn't have like enough wisdom to satisfy me. But the sila part, following the rules, following the precepts, I could get that down. So I was really just super strict especially in my younger years. And so the main places that I used as the main parts or the main texts that I used as sources are mainly from this book, the Vinaya Mahavaga. It's in Burmese letters, but it says Mahavaga Pali there. And there's two chapters especially. There's the chapter on robes, the Cīvara Khandaka, and also the chapter on Katina or Katina Khandaka. And also, if I remember correctly, there's another obscure section in the Vinaya Chulavaga, which is right here, discussing the duties of a storehouse manager at a monastery. Like there's this passage, if a monk needs sandals, the storehouse manager will give him a pair of sandals. If he needs a belt, the storehouse manager will give him a belt. And then it has the list of all the different parts of a monk's robe. So apparently they had them already cut and stored. So a monk needs, say, an Ada Mandala or an Ada Kusi or something, which I'll explain later. The monk gives it to him. So you know that they're all supposed to be separate parts. Burmese robes nowadays, they just fold them and then sew across the fold and make it look like it's two pieces sewn together, which is just kind of a cheap way of faking it. And some of these monks' robes, I mean, they'll say on the package, you can buy these at monk paraphernalia shops in Asia, according to the rules of monastic discipline, but they aren't. They just simply are not. So, let's see. A monk's robe, it's made out of panels or khandas they have to be an odd number. They have to be at least 5. So they're like vertical and they're sewn together into like a more horizontal shape. But you have to have 5 of these panels. And each of these panels is made up out of 2 pieces, a larger piece and a smaller piece. So it's the mandala is the large piece and the Ada Mandala is the smaller piece. And if you read I.B. Horner's translation, she has absolutely no idea what a mandala and an Ada Mandala are. She's calling them like a circular seam and a semicircular seam or something. But actually, it's the main pieces of cloth that a monk's robe are made out of. And on the middle panel, which would be, right behind your back when you're wearing it, or maybe kind of over to one side, but the middle one, the mandala is pretty sure it's at the top. Let me check this. Oh, good thing I've got this to look at. Okay. No, the Ada Mandala is at the top. Maybe I should try and show this. It might not show up very good, but this is one end of the robe, and as you can see, you got sort of a seam kind of going down here, and that's dividing two khandas or 2 panels. So that part right here is dividing them up, and I'll get to that part. Or it's called a kusi. This strip of cloth here that covers up the seam of these 2 panels sewn together is called a kusi, and this is an Ada Kusi, separating the smaller piece, the Ada Mandala, with the mandala, and maybe I'll draw a picture that's easier to understand than me showing dark cloth that's all folded up and everything. So you've got one of these panels or khandas consists of a large piece of cloth and a smaller piece of cloth that are the mandala and the Ada Mandala that are sewn together, and then the seam where they are sewn together is covered by a smaller piece called an Ada Kusi, or a half kusi. Ada means half. And then the larger panels, once they're finished, they're connected with longer strips that go up and down that are called kusis. And I'm not exactly sure what the original meaning of the Pali term kusi is. So there are steps in sewing a robe. And again, if you try to read this in the books, you may get like really confused, obscure guesses. And I'm not 100% sure what all the words mean. I've had to take my best guess also. So the first step in sewing a robe together is called bandhana, or binding. And I think in like regular sewing jargon in English, it would be called basting, or just tacking the pieces together. You just make these large stitches just to hold the pieces in place. That's the first step. And you do, as a general rule, you do each panel separately. So the first thing you do is you just tack together the mandala and the adha mandala together. You wouldn't bother with the extra strips yet. Then the next stage is owadika, which is the laying down of strips. So wherever you have two pieces of cloth sewn together, you cover that place where they're sewn together, that seam, with a strip of cloth, which is on my robes, I'd usually make the strips like 3 or 4 inches wide, and then you'd hem the edges, so it'd be like, maybe an inch or half an inch narrower than that. So you'd sew that part over the hem. And again, the reason why they do this, as far as I can tell, is that cloth and thread in the Buddhist time were not very good, not like today. Especially if the cloth is rags that are picked up off the ground. And if it's anything like modern Burma, if you're out in a remote area and you find rags on the ground, I mean, they're just rags. I mean, they're just tatters and half rotten. And the cloth doesn't have any polyester in it like cloth nowadays. It's just cotton, and so it breaks easily. So you sew together like two panels of, or two pieces of a robe. You overlay that seam with a strip of cloth, and then you sew it down both sides, which strengthens it. So that's owadika. Then there's a stage called kandusika, which I really don't know what it means. It's one of the best guesses of one monk is that is like staining it or something, but like dusika can mean like staining, but yeah, I'm not sure about that. And then finally is called dahlikama. So first you tack the pieces together, then where the seam where they're tacked together, you lay a strip over that, you sew it down both sides so you got it on there good. And then finally the dahlikama, or making firm, is what dahlikama literally means, is you're making a one final seam right down the middle where you got the two pieces of cloth that were bound together plus the overlaying strip. All of it is sewn together into one, in one seam. So this thread is cinching down, all of the cloth in that seam. So bandhana is just tacking the cloth together, stitching it together loosely, or just roughly, just enough to get it together. Then the owadika is laying down the strips over the seams, and then the dahlikama is like sewing right down the middle of that strip to get all 3 layers of cloth in the like sewn together firmly. And again, you would do each panel separately, then you sew the panels together. And when you've done that, you've got like the 5 panels all sewn together, each panel made of a mandala and an adha mandala with an adha kusi covering the seam. And then the panels, where the panels are sewn together, you've got the longer kusi, not a half kusi, but a full kusi. And they're also, you've got it staggered so that one panel, it's got the adha mandala on top. That would be the middle panel. It'd have the small piece on top, the large piece on bottom. The one next to it would be the other way around, with the large piece on top and the small on bottom. So the adha kusis are kind of staggered like that. And whether any of you can understand what I'm talking about, um, I don't know. I mean, this video is very niche. I mean, it's going to be mainly of interest to monks, people who want to be monks, people who just are interested in ancient Buddhist monastic discipline, and maybe people who go to toga parties. I don't know. But anyway, once you've got that part sewn together, you know, the outline of the robe with all the panels sewn together, it should be just a little bigger than the desired size of the robe, which should be less than 9 by 6. And it's probably better to wash the cloth before you sew it, just so that any shrinkage has already happened, and so you don't get any unpleasant surprises after the first time you wash it. So at this point, you would turn the robe over, and the next part that you sew on are called anuwata. And anuwata literally in Pali means something like behind the wind, or after the wind. And it may be that it's just on the opposite side of the cloth that the wind is hitting. You know, it's like behind the wind because it's on the inside of the robe, I guess. And these are narrow strips like the kusis and arakusis. They're more narrow strips. Like, this is the inside of the robe, and you can see, I hope, that it's got like this little border, like a border strip. Most Burmese robes, you know, it's really wide. It's kind of ostentatious looking, but considering that the main purpose of it is just to reinforce the edges, it doesn't need to be any bigger than just a few inches. And if there's any experienced sewers out there, they would know that. I mean, this might be just sewing confusion, pardon the pun, but you'd put it on, kind of sew it on the outside and then fold it over to the inside so that the seam is inside, it's concealed. But anyway, that's called the anuwata, these strips that are on the inside of the robe. And mainly it's the borders, just the top, the bottom, the sides. And there's one other one, which is called the paribandhana. And that is a strip, as far as I could tell, it goes right down the middle, lengthways, on the inside. So it's an anuwata. And that's mainly just to reinforce. Paribandhana means just binding around. So it's just sort of reinforcing the center of it to keep the seams that are sewn with crappy cloth and crappy thread from splitting apart. And this has caused some confusion with regard to the meanings of these words, because the anuwata also have alternative names. So the top border on the inside of your robe, like if you're wearing the upper robe or the sangati, it would be at the top around your neck. It's called the giwayakam, which is the neck part. And then the bottom part is the jangayakam, or the knee part. And then the bahandam are the sides or the arm parts. So there are some people who think that the anuwata and the guwayakam and the jangayakam and the bahandam are the same, or they're different from each other. But I think that they're the same. It's just that the anuwata at the top is the neck piece. The anuwata at the bottom, you know, the inside border of the robe at the bottom is the knee piece. The inside border on the sides are the arm pieces, because there are various places in Vinaya that mention anuwata, and then there are other places in Vinaya that mention the various parts, the giwayakam and so forth, and they're never mentioned in the same passage. It's either one or the other, so I assume that they are the same. It's just that the different anuwatas on the inside of the robe have different names. And the paribandhana, that reinforcing strip down the middle, it's really not necessary in modern times with good cloth and good thread. In fact, the elaborate way of sewing these robes with the reinforcing strips and all that probably are not necessary either. But it says you're supposed to have it. You're supposed to do it. So I did it. And I'm the only monk that I know of who ever had the paribandhana, or the central reinforcing strip, on the inside of his robe. But I just did it just because I wanted the robe to be in accordance with the rules. And if you are sewing the top piece, the top anuwata and the bottom anuwata and the middle anuwata or the paribandhana, it's good to sew those on first before you sew on the sides, because then the sides kind of cover up the ends. Everything's all nice and neat. So with regard to sewing, the very last part of sewing a robe is sewing on the loops and tags. The loops are called pasaka, and the tags are called gantika. And the translator for the Polytech Society, who translated the books of discipline, I.B. Horner, in her cluelessness regarding technical Vinaya matters, guessed in a footnote that the pasaka, or the loop, is perhaps a bow for the dress. But what they are, they're sort of like the ancient Indian equivalent of buttons and buttonholes. See if I can find one. Oh, where did it go? It's on here somewhere. Okay. So this is too dark. You see this? You got this. I can't remember what this is called. What is this called? Let's see. Yeah, I can't remember. I don't have it written down either. Anyway, this little square of cloth here also has a name in Pali, but you're going to sew one of these not far from the bottom of the robe. This is the top. The top of the robe is this way. The bottom, this is down towards the bottom, and you've got this tag on this. It's kind of a little hook on here, and then on the other side, the opposite side, you've got the hook, and then you've got the loop, and so the hook goes into the loop, and there's rules on like allowable materials for making these. It's like there's this list. I think this is bone, ivory, horn, reed, bamboo, wood, lac, stone, copper, or shell. Although plastic and safety pins are used a lot in Burma. For a long time, I was just using large pieces of incense stick. You get these big incense sticks with like a pretty beefy stick to it. I just cut off a piece that big and just kind of, that would be the tag that would be, it kind of go crossways here, and then you put it through the loop, and then it would hook on, and that would hold it together. But there's all kinds of strange ways of doing it. There's some of them are made out of twisted thread somehow. I'm not exactly sure how that one works. Yeah, I think that should have been on the list too. I forgot to add it to the list. So the loop with the tag on it, or the piece with the tag on it, goes right at the edge of the robe, and then the loop that the tag hooks onto to hold your robe on. Like on a windy day, your robe can just get blown halfway off. That goes in 7 or 8 finger widths from the edge of the cloth. So it would be like, what, this much, not including the thumb. So, about this far in. And on Burmese monks, mostly it's down at the bottom, like I showed, although some Thai monks will have extra loop and tag up at the neck. And this is like largely a holdover from when Thai monks were wearing small robes, like, the 9x6 tuas or handspans that are like this big. So in that case, you'd hook it up here. I was using like Velcro for the top one, so that wasn't entirely kosher, but I just have it like kind of hooking together on this side. So I guess I wasn't entirely kosher. It's in accordance with the principle of the rules, where it was just sort of non-precious materials which were allowable for making these things. And there's no rule against putting Velcro on your robe to keep it from blowing off in the wind. So let's see here. So that, once you've done all that, you've done you've measured the cloth, you've cut it into pieces, and then you sew the mandala and the adha mandala. And there is kind of a way of cheating where you can just fold a longer strip of cloth, like 2/3 of the way down the length of it, sew it, and then you can just cut it. Whereas you've done the bandana part before you even cut it apart, which makes it easier and it's more likely to be straight that way. So you've done the bandana, which is tacking it together. You've laid the strips, the reinforcing strips over the seams, which is a wadika. The kandusika, I mean, if anyone knows what that means, you can tell me in the comments. And then you got the dalikama, which is like the final seam right down the middle that holds it together. Then you turn the robe over and you do the border and the paribandana in across the center. And then you put on the loops and the tags with those little square patches of reinforcing cloth, because there is a lot of strain in that part. If you don't use a piece of cloth, little piece of cloth folded over a number of times, at least 4 times, then I mean it's going to rip eventually. And I've found that a monk's robe usually lasts about 10 years before it wears out, especially if a monk is following the rules strictly and wearing only 3 robes. If you got a whole closet full of robes, some monks do, then they might last longer because you're not wearing the same ones every day. So I would get like canvas for the lower robe that just would last a little bit longer. This flimsy like poplin cloth or muslin or something does not last very long, especially on a lower robe. So then the next step, once you've got the thing dyed, or once you got the thing sewn together, then you dye it. And again, there's all kinds of Wunia rules about dyeing robes. It's supposed to be vegetable dye. You're not allowed to use things like blood or cow poop or things like that. It has to be made from plants, but it can come from just about any part of the plant. It can come from roots, stems, bark, leaves, flowers, or fruits. And Thai forest monks, I have been told, tend to use the heartwood of the jackfruit tree for dyeing their robes, and it comes out sort of a kind of a greenish, brownish, yellowy color, which isn't bad. In Burma, they like a redder color, so they prefer the inner bark of the jackwood tree. In one state in the south, some of the very strict monks down there use the inner bark of the ironwood tree, which makes it kind of a burgundy color, almost kind of it's like a purplish color. Mostly, I used catechu, which is it comes from the kutch tree. It's a kind of acacia tree, and it's like a water soluble resin. This sort of a russet, like a reddish brown color. And it's easy to get because in the marketplaces in Upper Burma, you can buy blocks of it at the marketplace because some people use it as an ingredient in betel quids. And betel quids, if you're not unfamiliar with South Asia, it's a kind of drug similar to like chewing tobacco. You got like the betel leaf, and you put little pieces of areca nut or betel nut and some lime, like quick lime or slaked lime or something. It's not the citrus fruit; it's the mineral. And then sometimes they'll put like other things like a little tobacco or some of this catechu stuff, and then you make it into this thing and you stick it in your mouth and you chew it. I tried it once or twice. Sometimes when I was a monk going for alms in the town of Meitila, people would offer betel quids. So anyway, I used that stuff, the catechu stuff, for dyeing my robes. In the West, I had some people tell me that the skins of yellow onions make good dye. It's sort of a golden brown kind of a dye. And I assume coffee grounds would work good too. Um, but I mean, you'll have to find something that works. And I was told that some of the forest monks in Thailand, see, one problem with dyeing robes like this is the dye is not very sturdy. It just fades out really fast. And there are some things like turmeric, I think, which is sort of a powdery yellow color. You're not allowed to use that just because it notoriously would just wash out, and just the very first time you wash your robe. And it can be pretty depressing. You go through all the work to dye your robes, and then the first time you wash it, it just goes back to almost the original color, almost white again. So the way I was doing it, and I mean, if you meet forest monks, if you're dyeing a robe, some forest monk walks up and he'll just tell you, well, this is how you're supposed to do it. And then everyone's got their own way of doing it. But you have to have like a cauldron. And you can buy cauldrons pretty cheap in Southeast Asia. And you pour in the water and you dissolve the dye. And then what I would do is I'd wrap the robe around a stick or a short bamboo pole, and then you just feed it through the dye and kind of roll it up on the other end, kind of like a scroll. And I was told that the Thai monks, instead of washing the robes, they would just dye it in hot dye every time they wanted to wash it. And I mean, that would have like a washing effect. Certainly, it has a sterilizing effect because you've got the dye boiling hot. So that's a good idea if you've always got a cauldron handy, and all the other paraphernalia needed, the dye and all that. Then the more you do it, I mean, the more stable, the more it stains the cloth. Although when I was using catechu, um, the first time, right after you dye it and then you hang it up to dry, there's this obscure little rule: you're not allowed to walk away from the robe that's hung up to dry after you dye it until after the drips stop dripping down. You have to wait for that to happen before you can go and do other things. Um, oh, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, it's the cloth is so stiff; it's like cardboard. It's like you can carry your robe like a sheet of plywood. Sometimes it's so stiff. And see, there's a list of colors that are forbidden. A robe in the Buddhist time was like a brownish or tawny color, sort of a yellowy, brownish, light brown color. But there is a list of unallowable colors, which includes white, because that was like lay people wore. Like blue, like ironically bright saffron yellow is not an allowable color in Theravada Buddhism, even though there's all this talk about the saffron robe and so forth. Technically speaking, that bright saffron yellow color is not allowable. Crimson, or in Burmese, it's chet thueyan, or chicken blood color. Bright orange. You see a lot of monks wearing bright orange robes, but technically that is also a forbidden color. Strangely, green and gray and a few others are not on the list of forbidden colors, although it would be considered strange. I kind of like the idea of wearing gray robes. I mean, it would be allowable, it wouldn't be against the rules. And I prefer gray clothes to brown clothes anyway. Maybe if one starts up a new sect or something, one could wear gray ones. So you've got the robe sewn together and you've got it dyed. Then the last thing you have to do before you can wear it is you have to discolor the robe. And this is a strange, obscure rule of monastic discipline. It's in the Patimokkha that before you wear your robe, you have to discolor it with like a blackish or dark brownish or like a mud color. And that has developed into meaning that you have to put a dark spot on the robe. And probably it just meant that you were discoloring it. I mean, you were making it less valuable. You were just sort of staining it. Um, I think somewhere in the texts, there's a different explanation. It was like used for identifying your robe. But considering that you have to put a spot on there that's at least the size of a bed bug, but no bigger than a peacock's eye, and I assume that's in the tail. So it'd be, you'd make a spot, yay big on your robe, some dark spot. You use like a Sharpie or something and just make a spot on your robe. And you say Imam Bindu Kapam Kromi 3 times while you're saying, I make this spot. That's what you're supposed to say. Um, but I think originally the whole purpose of that rule of discoloring it was, I mean, that was originally the rule that says you have to dye your robe. You can't just wear an undyed white cloth robe. But then the meaning got lost or obscured, or it just sort of evolved into making this spot. In Thailand, they make three little spots in kind of a triangle. Just it's like on the edge of your robe. It's all the robes that I have got it on there somewhere. Um, so you just make that one spot the bindu kapam, and that's it. Then it's ready to wear. You'd have to determine it. You have to determine the robe, and that's sort of getting into other things. So I won't go into the details of determining robe. I doubt that very many people have gotten this far with the video anyway. And so finally you're allowed to wear the thing, and there's almost limitless ways of wearing the upper robe. Like Burmese monks, when they're working, they can take their upper robe and just kind of tie it into like a vest thing that leaves their arms free, because I mean monks robes are just not designed for doing manual labor in. Like try go up and down a ladder with like a sarong that comes down below your knees. I mean you're stepping on your robe all the time. Yeah, just trying to sweep with an upper robe on thrown over one shoulder, it just keeps falling off. You have to like use clothespins or whatever. You use your belt to tie it on. um, when you put on the lower robe, there is a list of obscure fashions for wearing lower robes, because as I say, everyone was wearing these things. The monks wore brown shabby ones. Everyone else is wearing, well, most everyone else is wearing more likely to be white, nicer ones. But there is a way of wearing the lower robe in Thailand that's where you roll it up. I suppose I should get up and try and do this here. Move the chair out of the way. So this is my old monk's lower robe. And it's made out of canvas, so it would last longer. Maybe you can see it easier on this, but it's also divided up into kuthis and khandas and adamandalas, mandalas, adakusis, kusis, and they're staggered so that I hope you can see this. Anyway, you don't need to have loops and tags on the lower robe, because the way you wear it is you just put it around like this. Man, I have not done this in a long time. I just got this down from the attic so I can show you good people how to do it. So you hold it out like this, and then you push in here, and then you go like this, and then you fold it over again like this, and then you fold it like that. And then you go like that. And there you go. That's how the lower robe is worn. And if you're going to be in public with this thing, you have to have a belt too. And there's two allowable kinds of belts. There's the pig intestine belt, and then there's the strip of cloth. And the pig intestine belt just means it's a twisted rope. So you can use a rope or a piece of cloth, a strip of cloth as a belt. You tie it around here, and that holds the lower robe on. It won't fall off in embarrassing ways when you're in the middle of the village. And when you're going to wear the upper robe, I've got a snap on this one instead of the Velcro I was talking about. You just throw it over both shoulders. Try to neaten it up a little bit. And then there's a bunch of rules like in the Patimokkha. Your robe shouldn't be hanging down too much in the front, shouldn't be hanging down too much in the back. The corners should be even and so forth. But see, here's the loop and the tag. Let's see, where is here it is, way down here. So here's the loop, and then you just connect that. And then if you got ones up here, you connect that too. And you're ready to appear in public. And you take your monk's bowl. And the way monks went for alms in the Buddhist time is they'd have the bowl. They didn't have bowl lids. They would just carry their bowl underneath their robe. And then you lift up with the left hand, hold out the bowl with the right hand, let them put the alms in, and then you just put it back in, and you'd use your own robe as the bowl lid because they hadn't been invented yet apparently. And if you're just lounging around the monastery or you're going to pay respects to a monk, then you put it over one shoulder. You bare one shoulder. If you don't have a flannel shirt on, you just hold it like this, throw that over there, go like that. And this is the way a monk's robe was worn, with one shoulder bared. But enough of me wearing robes. Oh, that's literally the first time I've worn a robe in more than a year. So, let's see here. One issue I would like to bring up is that there is this kind of situation where monks who are ordained in an Asian tradition, they'll wear Asian monk robes, like thin cotton robes suitable for the tropics. And then they come to the USA or Europe or someplace cold in the winter anyway, and the robes just aren't warm enough to keep them warm. So then they start wearing like shirts, sweaters, thermal underwear, socks, caps, Arctic expedition gear and so forth underneath their robes. But I mean, you can say, well, you just need thicker cloth, thick wool robes. But then you can't do the tie stuff of wrapping it all around your arm and everything. It's too thick to do that. You have to have thinnish cloth to wear a robe, the way, Thai fashion or Burmese fashion for that matter. But if you're just wearing a small one and you're just throwing it over your shoulders like a shawl, like I showed you, then it can be thick. You can have thick cloth like a blanket. And so like wearing just 3 robes made out of thick cloth will keep you warm. I mean, it's relatively warm. I mean, in the Buddha's in the Pali texts, in ancient India in the Buddhist time, it got down to about freezing in the wintertime. And so the Buddha wore 3 robes. It's like the lower robe, the upper robe, and then you got the double layer sangati. And he said that was enough for any monk, down to about freezing. But a monk is allowed to keep felt. Felt is not woven. It doesn't count as cloth. And so if that isn't enough, you can just throw a wool felt blanket, like an old army surplus blanket, over the top of that. And I mean, that'll keep you down. That'll keep you comfortable down to freezing weather. I mean, your feet might get cold, but it's going to save you from hypothermia. And all the shirts and all this stuff that Western monks tend to wear, or Asian monks in the West tend to wear, not only is it strictly against the rules, but it's just unnecessary. Excuse me. So I guess that's it. This isn't nearly as long of a video as I thought it was going to be. And again, with the belts, with the sukaranda is one kind of allowable belt, and the patika, I think, is the other kind. Patika just means a strip of cloth. Sukaranda literally means pig intestine, but apparently pig intestines are twisty. Like in Burmese, wetu is the word for screw, which literally means pig intestine. So because it's twisty, so it's just a twisted rope. Those would be the 2 completely kosher kinds of belts. They got all kinds of weird, like macrame kind of things that might count as a strip of cloth, but I usually just took a strip of cloth. Like you get lots of extra strips. You're cutting strips for making your robe. The anuwatas and the kusis and so forth are these strips of cloth. You can use one of those. Although if you get like a silkier kind of cloth, because you have to tie it, and if it's kind of rough cloth, it doesn't work as well. It wears out pretty fast. So for those of you who want to know how to make monk robes, that's essentially how to do it. And if you want to know how to bake bowls and do a few other technical monk things in accordance with the rules, some of that information is in my book here, Essays in Theravada Buddhism, with the link below. This is the one book that I wrote that would be of most interest, I think, to monks trying to live the life of a forest monk, or lay people wanting to understand what it's like to live the life of a forest monk. Someday, I mean, I've got the material um, compiled already. I could publish another book just on my own personal experiences, which also might be helpful to people wanting to know what it's like. But that's it for the video, and it's been about an hour, and be happy.